Maybe we can start as a leaping off point for a further discussion, and I'd like all of you to participate in this as well in just a moment. But we could start by asking both of you to reflect on, respectively, looking at these two political leaders, what you think perhaps was their biggest triumph, respectively, and their biggest failure.
In terms of lasting achievements, I think Keating's biggest triumphs were as Treasurer rather than as Prime Minister. I think his agenda as Treasurer struck a chord, not necessarily in the general community, which was never especially enamoured of economic reform, but amongst those who think about public life, economists, academics, fellow politicians, journalists. And I think Keating, with Hawke's support, did build many of the pillars of our present prosperity. I think Howard's legacy, I think, will be a little broader, because I think that there were the economic achievements, but I do think Howard's greatest achievement, perhaps, was to end some of those divisive debates that we had when Keating was Prime Minister. We are still a multicultural nation, but we don't feel bad about multiculturalism. We are still a monarchy, but we don't feel that we are in some way immature. We still have terrible difficulties with getting Aboriginal people to the same economic levels that the general community enjoy. But I don't think we look down on Aboriginal people anymore the way we might have a generation ago. So I think Howard actually made us relaxed and comfortable about ourselves. He was much mocked for that phrase at the time, but I think he actually achieved that in his public career.
Can I pick you up on one thing there? You don't think the history wars were in any way divisive? Was that Howard's kind of divisive contribution to rival the Keating notional divisiveness?
Well, I think what Howard did in the history wars was just assert what I think is screamingly obvious, but which had been neglected for probably a generation, namely that the progressive idea of history, that over time we tend to get better, and I think in Australia's case that is self-evidently correct. I mean, our history is an extraordinary example of very inauspicious beginnings that have been crowned with the most extraordinary success.
All right, let's pick Paul up then on greatest triumphs and greatest mistakes.
They tend to be the flip side of the same story to a certain extent, I think. I think Keating's main achievements are economic. And one of the things that struck me when I did the book is, having written about the 1980s, obviously the 1980s was a fundamental turning point when the economy was opened up by Hawke and Keating. I think Keating's economic achievements as Prime Minister were greater than what I'd realised. In particular, national competition policy, the end of centralised wage fixation and the creation of a system of enterprise bargaining in the IR system, the foundations for central bank independence and an era of low inflation, and maintenance of the tariff cuts despite the deepest recession since the 1930s. So I think what Keating did as Prime Minister was to enhance and defend the economic legacy that he and Hawke began in the 1980s. I think that was a very significant achievement. I think that the other achievement that I would identify from Keating is what I referred to in my presentation, what I call his new light on the hill agenda. The problem with this is that he couldn't defend it politically. I'm talking now about Mabo and the Republic in particular. I think he will be remembered for this agenda, and I do think if we eventually become a republic sometime over the next few decades, Keating will be seen as a result of that to have been a prime originator of the idea. One of the interesting things about Keating when you talk to him these days is that he's looking ahead, sometimes decades ahead, for the vindication of his prime ministership. His foreign policy was important. The origins of a grand strategy integrating the United States alliance with Asian engagement. With Howard, I think economic management is very important. Howard and Costello presided over a long period of unbroken economic growth. This was enormously successful. They benefited very greatly from Keating, from what Keating put in place, but they enhanced it. They didn't stuff it up. I think overall the fiscal and monetary management was very good. There's virtually no other industrialised democracy which in this period, that is from the early 90s through to 2007, did not go into recession. And Australia averted that problem. I think Howard's foreign policy achievements are very significant after an incredibly shaky start. To my way of thinking, his principal foreign policy achievement is that he brought Australia simultaneously closer to both America and Asia. I've got no doubt that that will be seen as his principal achievement. And in social terms, I think he will endure for having been seen to have put the concept of personal responsibility on the agenda in a very big way. This will not go away. Rudd can't afford to walk away from this idea, and he won't. And I think this concept of greater personal responsibility, which is a very conservative idea, is on the agenda in a much stronger way because of Howard.
Okay. But Paul, I wondered also if I might pick up something you made almost as a throwaway line in your speech. You were saying that at one point in the 1980s there were joint Howard-Keating parties in Old Parliament House. Would you care to share a few recollections?
Oh, I couldn't reveal what happened. No, the parties were good. This is this period, very interesting period. Keating is Treasurer, still getting into the job, sees himself very much as a reformer. The zenith of this thing is 1985. Keating, after the 1984 election, decides he's going to run on a big tax reform package. This became the famous Option C, which was Keating's effort to get up a broadly based indirect tax. He campaigned around the country on this and was threatening to resign if he didn't get it up. Unbelievably attached to it with a profound passion. Howard at this stage, this is before September 85, Howard is deputy, Peacock is Liberal leader, Howard is deputy and shadow treasurer. Howard believes in tax reform, and he'd taken a similar reform to the Fraser cabinet but had it knocked back. So essentially, Keating and Howard were seen as the respective economic reformers and sort of mini heroes on both sides, and they began talking to one another a bit and actually tried to help one another, hence the joint parties. The parties, as I said, were very good. Keating and Howard had a cordial relationship at the parties, but it was the 1980s, so we all had a good time.
Tony, is there anything of that camaraderie left in the modern body politic?
I think it would require a great cause that was shared across the party divide for that to happen. One of my most pleasant nights, though, in Parliament House was the last sitting Thursday of 2003. Latham had just become the leader. On that very day, I made my infamous Trail of Human Wreckage speech about Latham. Turned out to be quite prescient, I thought, but nevertheless, I made that speech that day and was very unpopular with...
Careful, his publishers here.
With even my leader for doing so. But that night, late at night, I had to go and see the then opposition whip for something. There must have been half a dozen Labor members in the whip's office having a few drinks. They said, "Oh, Tony, have a drink." I sat down between Julia Gillard and Craig Emerson. Guitar came out. It was just the most fantastic night, I've got to say. But it was almost like the soccer match that allegedly happened in no man's land on Christmas of 1914. It doesn't happen very often, I'm afraid, that kind of thing.
Magnificent.
What was that Everly Brothers number? Living in the love of the common people.
Magnificent. I wondered if we can turn it over to our audience now to see if they've got some burning questions. Yes.
Yeah, just on the theme of big ideas, one of the common criticisms of a Bill of Rights is that it would be a lawyer's day out and that the lawyers stand to gain the most from that. Now, Jeffrey Robertson has replied to that by saying that basically he does most of his human rights work pro bono, and that most human rights lawyers actually earn less money than politicians and journalists. I just wondered what you thought about that.
I don't care how much money they earn. I don't want lawyers and judges deciding policy on fundamental social issues for the country. I'm very much of the view that parliaments and governments should have fundamental responsibility for these issues. The American system is totally different. Well, are there more rights for the American people than there are for the Australian people? And once you start to try and codify these rights, well, what's a right and what isn't? And essentially, one particular right often infringes another right. I mean, there are conflicts here. There are conflicts that need to be arbitrated. The way I want them to be arbitrated, I want them to be arbitrated with a particular piece of legislation on a particular issue that goes through the Parliament that has to address the issue of rights. I don't want an arrangement under which, through a Human Rights Act, the judiciary is required over time to interpret new laws passed by the Parliament, not according to the intentions of the Parliament at the time, but according to a previous Human Rights Act. Now, this is a concern for democracy. There are so many concerns for democracy about this issue, we could spend a lot of time talking about them. That particular issue I raised was put on the table by the Chief Justice of New South Wales, Jim Spiegelman, last week. So, as I say, I think there are fundamental issues for our democracy about this, and I think, on balance, we don't assist the cause of human rights through this sort of measure.
I suspect Tony may have a similar view, but let's hear from him.
Well, look, I would entirely support what Paul said.
Okay.
I think often as I read histories about what happens in the 1980s, there seems to be some sort of thought that first there was this Keating government that went from 1983 to 1996, and then there was a Howard government. What sort of role do you think Bob Hawke played in Australia's, well, in Labor's legacy in particular, and what do you think his contribution
Why don't you take that first?
Okay, well, Paul's asked me if I can briefly reflect on that.
Because Paul has a rich sense of humour.
You know, Keating devised the policy and sold the policy, but treasurers can only do what prime ministers will allow them to do. And in the end, while Keating was totally converted early in his time as treasurer to the various policies that he was then associated with, it was Hawke's government and it was Hawke's authority that ultimately blessed those policies. So I think that Hawke has got to be given a great deal of the credit for that. And I think the idea that anything really significant can be done by a government without the Prime Minister's active support is just wrong.
I think this is a really good question. In the introduction to my new book, There's about a 2,500 word introduction where I try and put Howard and Keating in historical context. What I say in the introduction is there have been two great Labor Prime Ministers, John Curtin and Bob Hawke. And the reason they're the great Labor Prime Ministers is because they both defined and created a new era of Australian history. What Curtin did as a wartime leader was two things. He prosecuted the war and he laid the foundations for post-war reconstruction, which the Chifley government then followed through. So it was Curtin who really, in the 1940s, which I think was an enormously creative decade in Australian history, who laid the foundations for that era, which Menzies, when he won in 1949, was brilliant enough to maintain. What Hawke did in the 1980s was, Hawke was a reformer who carried the people behind the reform. I think Hawke's consensus technique and his popularity combined with his high intelligence and good judgment meant essentially that what happened in the 1980s was that we changed the direction of the country in economic terms, but the people didn't revolt. Hawke won the elections and he kept the electorate behind the reforms. Now that is a high degree of political sophistication. He was helped enormously by Keating, but this was a Hawke government with Keating as Treasurer, a remarkable government, and Hawke did define that era.
I'm just wondering why you think the Labor government is really a government of no big ideas, the current Labor government.
Well, this is a new government. Now, it takes governments a while to get established. Howard's first 18 months were really shaky, very, very shaky. Whitlam did too much and basically committed political suicide. Hawke and Keating were pretty good in their first 18 months. But the character of a government evolves. It evolves on the job. And the Rudd government is going to be defined essentially by its response to the global financial crisis. So I think it's early days yet, but my inclination is to think that there is a fundamental change of era. Kevin Rudd is a very modern politician. Remember, when John Howard became Prime Minister in 1996, Kevin Rudd was not in the Parliament. Rudd was only elected to the Parliament in 1998. So Rudd's elected to Parliament in 1998. Keating is elected in 1969 and Howard is elected in 1974. So the sense of generational change here, I think, is profound. So Rudd is a modernist, whether it's his mastery of the 24-hour media cycle, his fascination by technology. Now, he's a very sophisticated politician in both his ability to address policy issues and master policy issues, yet master the 24-hour media spin. I think the really critical question for Kevin Rudd as we go on is, what does he really believe? What are his underlying convictions? What are the real beliefs of the modernist?
Yeah, look, I think it's a good question that you ask, and I suspect that it reflects the frustration of a lot of people of the left that this doesn't appear to be a government with much of a soul, I suspect. But you know, I think with Rudd, his undeniable intelligence is basically being applied to the art of politics rather than to the art of government. I think he's investing an enormous amount of time in, as Paul says, media management and spin, and not all that much time in really making a difference other than simply winning elections. Now, obviously, I'm a critical observer, but nevertheless, that is how it looks to me. By contrast, you said earlier, Paul, that John Howard didn't get into government with a master plan. I think that's wrong. I think that future directions, as developed by Fightback, constituted a blueprint. Bits of it were actually cannibalised by Keating, and then I think the rest of it was put into practice by and large under John Howard. I think that is what distinguishes John Howard from all other conservative leaders in this country. He had an agenda. Now, I don't think that makes him less conservative. I think it just means that he was a different kind of conservative. He was an activist conservative who applied conservative values in a kind of a dramatic way rather than simply minded the shop and responded to events. But
in a sense, it seems like there might have almost be something of a reverse model here where you think Howard came to power with such a comprehensive agenda and then arguably ran out of ideas towards the end of a government, whereas Rudd and modern Labor have come to power and are finding their feet, finding their way, and there are still some very big open reformist questions for them, particularly around those two big issues of the questions of reforming the tax system and taking on a fundamental reform of the health system, which are just hanging question marks essentially at this point in time.
Yeah, it's very. I mean, you know, it'll be interesting to see what does come out of this stuff. But he essentially asked Ken Henry to tell him what to do with the tax system, and he essentially asked Christine Bennett to tell him what to do with the health system. Now, that's fine, but we actually elect the politicians. We don't elect the bureaucrats. And I think that Keating and Howard drove the agenda in a way that I'm not sure this guy is going to. I mean, you know, I hope I'm wrong because I think it would be good for Australia to have the Prime Minister driving the agenda as opposed to managing the spin.
Do you think there's anything in that criticism, Paul? I mean, we've seen this model from state Labor governments, and I'm minded particularly here in Victoria of this seemed to be a specialty of Steve Bracks when he was in power here, that the favourite modus operandi seemed to be that you would set up an independent commission headed by an expert in a field, you'd commission a detailed study and review, you'd accept that and have a think about it as a government, and then you'd cherry pick some recommendations that were politically palatable and that the budget could afford and discard those that were going to cost you too much, either economically or in political terms. Is that a borrow from that textbook?
Well, I think that the current national government has emerged after this quite long period of successful Labor rule in the states. And I think this has influenced Labor Party culture very significantly. So that you've got a lot of personnel coming from state Labor administrations now to Canberra to work for the Rudd government. You've got a lot of political tacticians, a lot of the party apparatchiks have been raised on their success in terms of state Labor governments, and again, this influences the culture. So I think this is a really important influence, yes. The point I'd make is that national governments are fundamentally different from state governments. And I think at the end of the day, you can't just translate the political strategies.
Okay. Up here.
My question follows on quite closely with that comment around the states issue. And I think one of the things that Paul didn't remark upon, but has been one of the fundamental shifts of the Hawke, Keating and Howard prime ministerships was the fundamental shift of power from state governments to the central government. And it seems now to be particularly fashionable to support centralisation in the hands of the Commonwealth, culminating in Tony's quite risky proposal, in my view, to put the national parliament, to give it precedent over all state parliaments on all matters. And I would be very interested to seek Paul's comment on that shift how he sees it playing out and what he thinks is an effective balance between state and Commonwealth government.
Well, I'll just say a few things and then Tony will have something to say on this as well. There's no doubt that what you say is correct, that the shift of power within the Federation was conspicuous under Keating and Howard. Remember, in 1991, when Keating was campaigning for the Prime Ministership, he went out of his way to attack Hawke, Griner New Federalism. And Hawke, Griner New Federalism was a cooperative federalism model which was looking at vesting more taxing powers with the states. Keating gave a dramatic speech and he said, "This will happen over my dead political body. You know, we will not be giving taxing powers back to the states." And this was a ferocious sentiment that Keating had, drawing upon his entire time as Treasurer. It's particularly pertinent to recall this in the light of the Henry tax review. The other point I'd make is that when I was interviewing Howard government ministers, I was surprised by the extent of the reoccurring theme that came up all the time. We couldn't deal with the states. The states were impossible. Now, admittedly, they were Labor states, but this sense of frustration, which virtually every minister, not all of them, but virtually every minister, every senior minister in the Howard cabinet had, was very interesting to me. No matter what their personality was, they were unbelievably frustrated with the states. And Howard, of course, was frustrated as well. But nothing much happened. Nothing much happened. There was a sense of frustration, but there was no fundamental decision taken about strategy. It was almost as though they couldn't decide what to do. The final point I'd make is, these days in the Australian economy, a lot of our future economic success and our productivity performance will be a function of what happens at the state level. The states, in this sense, are really important for our future economic success, and we've got to address this problem. I don't think there are any easy answers. It's one of the historic challenges facing the Rudd government.
Could I ask the questioner, why is it risky to put more authority in the hands of the democratically elected national government?
I suppose that I believe fundamentally that there will be interests represented by state governments, that state governments will be better able to represent their local constituents in an effective way, particularly when it comes to issues such as service delivery I think that on a whole range of issues, state governments do it well, and perhaps not in the last few years, but they have the potential to do it well. And I think that state governments generally, I think that you can get competition on policy, if you like, so that you get better policies.
Okay, well, can you give me one example other than death duties?
Energy regulation.
In Queensland. What's this?
Energy regulation. I'd say that Victoria, for example, has got by far and away the best energy system, if you like, energy supply system.
And if the example is so good, why hasn't it been adopted by the other states?
Well, it will in time, I hope. Perhaps because of the interfering hands of the federal government as they take over national energy regulation.
Okay, but wouldn't it be better if the federal government, the national government, had the capacity, seeing good work in Victoria, to say to the other states, you really should do this, and if you drag the chain, we will make you do it. See, I'm not saying that the federal government should do everything. I'm just saying that the federal government should have the ability to give an order to the states if the states are significantly mucking up, in the same way that it could give an order to the territory and bring about the intervention, which is just as needed in the states as in South Australia, in the Kimberleys, in Cape York, just as needed there as it was in the territory, but the states made it impossible to do that. Let me ask you another question.
Well, can I just
no,
respond
come on,
to you first?
let me ask you a question now. Why is a democratically elected federal parliamentarian somehow not as close to the people as a state parliamentarian? Why is the state parliamentarian intrinsically more in touch than the federal parliamentarian?
I think I'm not sure that they are. I think, though, that the Commonwealth government and the way that the parliaments are structured don't actually represent equally, for example, 12 senators coming from Tasmania, 12 senators from
90,000
Victoria.
people in Perth have the same representation as 90,000 people in Sydney.
In the lower house, yes. But if I wasn't intending to engage in debate with you, but if I was to return to
So you get more than you paid for.
And why shouldn't the audience be put on the spot?
No, I think that-
why are we always the ones on the spot?
But I think this...
I'm very, very happy to be put on the spot. And if we can return to that previous point, I think that I much prefer, a spirit of cooperation rather than orders coming from the central government to the states if they muck up. And I fear that the federal government could muck up in ordering the states. In fact, I have no great faith in the federal government to not muck up when it gives orders to the states.
But
so I don't think that...
Okay, but you see, the problem at the moment, as people who actually deal with the system, as opposed to dwell in the domain of abstract political science, is that in lots of areas of government, no one is really in charge now. You've got federal funding, you've got state authority when it comes to schools, when it comes to hospitals, when it comes to water, when it comes to infrastructure. And that's why so much in these areas is a bugger's muddle. It really is.
This opens another very, very interesting whole can of worms. But unfortunately, we are horrendously out of time, so we're going to have to wrap up proceedings. But can I please invite you to thank both of our guests tonight. Thank you and have a good night.